What if I told you that the Exodus was not just an ancient story of those who were stuck in the past, and if what happened in Egypt, with plagues, judgment, and deliverance, wasn't it an isolated event, but part of something much bigger? Now think with me for a second. Millions of people have read the book of Exodus. Millions have also heard of the apocalypse, but almost no one stops to ask a simple question, and at the same time disconcerting. What if these two stories are connected? And if what happened back then is actually a model, a pattern, a warning? Because when you start looking closely, some details begin to jump out before the eyes. In Egypt, there was a people being oppressed. In Revelation, we see a world moving towards a system of oppression. In Egypt, God sends plagues. In Revelation, judgments are poured out on the earth. In Egypt, there is a separation between those who are protected and those who suffer the judgment. In the apocalypse, this separation also appears. Coincidence, or is there a pattern being repeated? And here's the point that almost no one realizes. The Bible is not just a collection of disconnected stories. It is a continuous narrative, a plan, a progressive revelation, and sometimes what seems to be the past. In fact, it is a mirror of the future. Now let me ask you something direct. Why would God do something so specific in Egypt, with so many details? What if that didn't have a meaning that goes beyond that moment? Why the blood on the thresholds? Why the distinction between houses? Why did judgment come in the form of plagues? These elements are not there by chance. They carry a message. And when you start connecting those dots, you notice something that completely changes the way you read the Bible. The Exodus was not just liberation, it was a rehearsal, a model, a shadow of something greater that is yet to be fulfilled. And maybe, while many people look at the apocalypse as something distant, complicated, or even too symbolic, the key to understanding all this: be in a story you already know, a story that begins with slavery, it goes through trial, and ends with liberation. But what really connects these two narratives, it is not just judgment. There is a central detail, an element that changes everything. And when you understand that, you won't be able to read Exodus anymore, nor Apocalypse, in the same way. Now let me take you a little deeper into this reflection, because there is a question that, honestly, almost no one asks. Most people read Exodus as an isolated story, something that happened back there, with a specific people, in a specific context. A powerful narrative, yes, but distant, almost like a historical record. On the other hand, when it comes to Revelation, the approach changes completely. People look at it as something that is yet to happen, a distant future, full of symbols, mysteries, and events that are difficult to understand. Something that is up ahead, separate, disconnected. And then, without realizing it, the mind creates two boxes. On the one hand, the past. On the other, the future. On one side, Exodo. To the other, Apocalypse. But let me provoke you with something very serious now. What if this division is wrong, and if the problem is not in the texts, but in the way we were taught to read the Bible? Because the truth is that the Bible never presents itself as a set of loose stories. It presents itself as a single narrative, coherent, intentional. Each event, every detail, each symbol points to something bigger. And this is exactly where this question starts to bother you. But how? What if Exodus and Revelation are part of the same story, not just connected in a symbolic way, but linked by a real pattern? A pattern that repeats itself, a pattern that reveals how God acts. Now think with me. If God delivered a people through judgment, separating who was covered from those who were not, and then in the apocalypse, we see judgment being poured out again, a separation going on, a people being preserved. Are we seeing two different stories, or the same story, being told at different times? And here is where everything starts to get more serious. Because if that's true, so the Exodus is not just past, and the apocalypse is not just the future. They are parts of the same plan, a plan that crosses time, a plan that reveals the character of God, a plan that shows how He acts in the face of oppression, of sin, and the need for redemption. Now you realize the impact of this. This means that the Exodus was not just a historical miracle. He was a model, a visible pattern of something invisible, something that is still unfolding. And perhaps that's why so many details have been recorded so accurately. Nothing there is random, nothing there is an exaggeration, nothing there is just symbolic. Each element carries a meaning, and when you start looking at those details, with this perspective, the Bible begins to open up in a completely different way. But to see this clearly, we need to go back to a very specific moment. One night, a night that changed everything. A night where life and death passed side by side. A night where the difference between being hit or being protected, I wasn't in the force, I wasn't in the position, it was not on the merits, but in something very specific. And to understand this, we need to go back to that night in Egypt. Now go back with me to that scenario, Egypt. Not as a simple background to the story, but as a complete system, an empire, a power structure, a place where an entire people were living under oppression. The Hebrews were not just working, they were being crushed. No freedom, no voice, no choice. It was a system that was sustained by force, in control, and exploration. And it is exactly in this context that God begins to act. But pay attention to this. God does not act immediately. He doesn't just come in, set the people free, and shut down history. There is a process, and this process reveals something very profound. The plagues. Many people look at pests as isolated events, punishments, manifestations of power. But when you look closely, he realizes that it was not random, it was progressive, organized, intentional. Each pest had a target, each plague confronted something. It was not only against the Egyptian people, it was against the system, against that which sustained Egypt. The waters that were a source of life become blood. The land that sustained begins to produce chaos. The darkness, it covers everything, taking away any sense of control. It is as if, little by little, everything that seemed stable began to fall apart. And this does not happen all at once. It happens in stages. First a shakeup, then another, until there is nothing left intact. Now stop and think. This doesn't just seem like a punishment, it looks like a dismantling, as if God were dismantling, piece by piece, an entire system, showing that what seemed unshakable, in fact, I was frail before His authority. And there is a detail here that completely changes the way we see all this. The people of Israel were in the middle of this scenario, but it was not hit in the same way. There was a distinction, a separation. While Egypt was suffering the effects of the judgment, there was a people being preserved. This is not just a detail. This is a pattern. Because what's happening there, it is not just liberation. It's judgment, but not a chaotic trial. A trial with purpose, targeted, controlled. Now you realize the depth of it. God wasn't just bringing a people out of Egypt. He was exposing a system, showing that everything that seemed powerful had no real authority before Him, and that changes everything. Because when you understand that, you begin to see the Exodus in a different way, not as a sequence of impressive miracles, but as the first great portrait of how God acts in the face of systems of oppression, in the face of sin, in the face of structures that rise up against Him. And that is exactly why this story cannot be treated as something isolated, because it reveals a pattern that, once identified, begins to appear elsewhere in Scripture. But there is a detail here, a detail that is more important than pests, more important than the judgment. even more important than the liberation itself, because in the middle of all this, there was something that defined who would be hit and who would be preserved. And this detail changes everything. But most importantly, it wasn't the plagues. Now pay attention to that, because this is where everything changes. In the midst of all that scenery, plagues, chaos, judgment, fear, there was a central element, something simple, but at the same time decisive: a lamb. It was not an army. It was not a human strategy. It wasn't strength, nor intelligence. It was a lamb. And God gives an extremely specific instruction. Each family should separate a lamb without defect, sacrifice it, and get the blood, and this blood should be placed on the doorposts. Now think about the scene. Outside, judgment was coming, something inevitable, something that no one could prevent. But inside that house, there was a brand, a visible brand, a brand that made all the difference. Because that night, what determined the fate of a house? It wasn't the one inside. It was not the history of that family. It wasn't if they were stronger, fairer, or more prepared. It was something much simpler, and at the same time much deeper. It wasn't about who you were. It was about what was on his door. If the blood were there, that house would be preserved. If it wasn't, the judgment would be reached. Simple as that. Now you realize the weight of that. Because this completely breaks human logic. We think about deserving. We think about effort. We think about who has the right. But there, none of that mattered. What mattered? It was the coverage, the blood. And this was not only symbolic. It was real. It was practical. It was visible. It was what separated life and death. Now let me ask you a direct question. Why would God do something so specific? Why require a lamb? Why blood? Why on the doorposts? Because this wasn't just about that night. It was a sign, a pattern, an early revelation of something much bigger. And it is exactly here that the connection begins to appear. Because when you go forward in the scriptures, this same element begins to emerge again. The lamb, the blood protection. In the New Testament, John the Baptist looks at Jesus and says, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." Do you understand? It's no coincidence. It is not a random comparison. It is continuity. It's the same pattern, being revealed more clearly. In Egypt, the lamb protected a house. In Christ, the lamb offers redemption to the world. And when you get to the apocalypse, the center of the scene, he is no ordinary king. He is not a warrior. It is not a system. It is the lamb. A lamb that was slain, but he is alive. A lamb that is on the throne. A lamb who is worthy to open the seals. Now stop and think about what that means. From Egypt until the apocalypse, the central element has never changed. Blood remains what separates. It continues to be what defines it. It continues to be what protects. And this completely changes the way we see everything. Because the Exodus wasn't just about getting out of Egypt. It was about being covered. It was about being marked. It was about belonging. And when you understand that, you begin to realize that this story didn't end that night. She continues. And the same principle is still at play. Because in the midst of every trial, there will always be a difference. And this difference, it is not in the circumstances, it is in the lamb. Now that you understand the role of the lamb and the weight of that blood that night, an inevitable question begins to arise. Is that in the past, or is that same pattern? Does it keep repeating itself? Because when you open the apocalypse and begin to read carefully, it is impossible not to notice some similarities, not superficial, deep. In Egypt, there was a system being judged. In Revelation, we again see a global system being confronted. In Egypt, judgment came in stages. In Revelation, judgments also come in sequence, seals, trumpets, and bowls. Nothing is random. Nothing is out of control. Everything follows a pattern, and just like in Egypt, there is something that draws attention. The destruction is not simply general, it is targeted, selective. There is a distinction. While some are hit, others are preserved. This appears clearly. In Egypt, the people who were under the blood were spared. In Revelation, we also see a people being guarded, sealed, and protected in the midst of judgment. Now stop and think about it calmly. This doesn't seem like just coincidence. It seems like continuity, as if what happened in Egypt was a smaller scale portrait of something much bigger that is yet to come. And this is where the comparisons start to get even stronger. Egypt, it represents a system, a place of oppression, an environment where the people of God were inserted, but it didn't belong. In Revelation, we see the world moving towards something similar, a global system, a structure that rises, that controls, that influences. The plagues in Egypt were not just punishments, they were direct confrontations against what sustained that system. In Revelation, judgments also play this role. They shake structures, they expose weaknesses, they show that what seemed solid can fall apart. And in the middle of it all, there is always a movement going on. In Egypt, judgment came, but there was also deliverance, a people being taken away, a path being opened. In Revelation, we see something similar, judgment, but also redemption. It's not just destruction, it's separation, it's a transition, it's the end of a system, and the beginning of something new. Now he realizes what is in front of his eyes. Egypt, world plagues, judgments, deliverance, final redemption. This is not a forced analogy, it's a pattern that runs through the entire Bible. And when you start to see that, the reading changes. The Apocalypse is no longer just a distant book, full of difficult symbols, and starts connecting with something you already know, something that has already happened, something that God has already done. And this has a very strong implication, because it means that God does not change the way he acts. He doesn't improvise. It reveals patterns. It shows before, so that we can later recognize it. And perhaps the Exodus was just that, an early revelation, a warning, a visible model of a process that is still ongoing. And the more you compare, it is harder to ignore, because the similarities are not superficial. They are structural, they are intentional, they are deep. But there is something even stronger behind all this, something that unites these two moments definitively, something that goes beyond pests, beyond judgment, beyond liberation. Because when you put all these pieces together, you begin to notice something that is impossible to ignore. But there is a pattern here that is impossible to ignore. Now, looking at all of this, it is becoming impossible to treat these connections as coincidence, because the Bible reveals something very clear, albeit silently. God does not act randomly. He doesn't improvise. He does not react at random. God works with purpose, with order, with intent, and more than that, he works with patterns, patterns that repeat themselves, patterns that reveal how he acts, how he judges, as he saves. And when you start to realize that, the reading of the Bible changes completely, because you stop seeing isolated events and begin to see a flow, a continuity, a story being built with coherence from beginning to end. Now think with me, if God has ever judged a system once, if he has ever separated a people in the midst of judgment, if you have already established a means of protection, why would he do it completely differently in the end? That wouldn't make sense, because God's disposition does not change. The way he acts reveals who he is. And that is exactly why the Exodus needs to be seen in another way, not only as liberation, not just as a miracle, but as a revelation. The Exodus was not only liberation, it was a rehearsal, a rehearsal of something bigger, a visible model of an invisible pattern, a preview of what is yet to be fulfilled. And when you start to see it that way, everything gains more depth. Plagues are no longer just historical events, and they become signs, the separation between the people. It is no longer just protection, and it becomes a principle, the Lamb. It is no longer just an element of the narrative, and becomes the center of everything, and that completely changes the weight of the story. Because the Exodus wasn't just about getting out of Egypt, it was about showing how God acts when the time comes to intervene. It was about revealing that there is a time when the system is confronted, a time when what seems unshakable starts to fall, a time when the judgment can no longer be postponed, and along with that, a time when the difference between being protected or not becomes definitive. Now look at the apocalypse with that lens, not as something isolated, not as a distant book, but as the continuation of a pattern already revealed. And this is where it all starts to fall into place. Because in the apocalypse, God also does not act in a chaotic way. There is order, there is progression, there is a sequence. The seals are opened, the trumpets sound, the bowls are poured. Everything follows a flow, everything follows a pattern, just like in Egypt. And once again, there is separation, there is a distinction, there is a people being preserved, while the judgment advances. Now realize the strength of this. This means that the apocalypse is not something entirely new. It's something recognizable. It's something that's been revealed before, to a lesser extent, simpler, but equally real. And perhaps this is why so many people have difficulty understanding Revelation, because they try to read it as something totally unprecedented, when in fact, the key may lie precisely in looking back, to realize that God has already shown this standard. He has already revealed this path. It has already given clear signals. And when you put it all together, the conclusion begins to form almost inevitably. And when you look closely, the apocalypse follows this same script, and it is exactly here that everything converges to a central point. Because when you take off all the layers, when you remove the details, when you look beyond the plagues, beyond the judgment, beyond the deliverance, there is one thing left: the Lamb. In the Exodus, everything revolved around him. The plagues were happening. The trial was moving forward. Egypt was being shaken, but in the midst of all this, there was a clear instruction: choose the Lamb, prepare the Lamb, apply the blood, because in the end, it was not the plagues that defined destiny, it was blood. Now think about it calmly. The whole of Egypt was going through the same night, the same darkness, the same moment, the same judgment, but the result was not the same for everyone. There was a difference, and this difference was not in the social condition. I wasn't in the force. It wasn't in the life story. It was in the blood. Who had the blood was protected. Who didn't have was reached by the court. Simple, direct, inevitable. And this reveals a spiritual principle that runs through the entire Bible. In the middle of the judgment, there will always be distinction, and this distinction, it will never be based on who you are, but who you belong to. And that brings us to something even deeper. Because when you go forward in the Bible, this same pattern does not disappear, it intensifies. In the New Testament, Jesus is not presented as an ordinary leader. He is not only presented as a master or prophet, he is presented as the Lamb. It's not a random title. It's not a pretty metaphor. It is a direct connection with what happened in Egypt. For as the Lamb was sacrificed that night, Christ was too, just as the blood was applied to the thresholds. The blood of Christ is also presented as that which covers, redeems, and protects. And when you get to the apocalypse, that doesn't change. In fact, this becomes even more evident. At the center of it all, there is the Lamb, not an empty symbol, but the central figure of redemption is the only worthy one. the only one who opens the seals, the only one who is on the throne. Now stop and think about the weight of it, from the Exodus to the Apocalypse, from Genesis until the end. Everything converges to the same point, the Lamb. This means that the most important element of the story, it's not the events, it's not the systems, it is not the judgments, it is the Lamb. That is what he stands for, because in the end, what defines who remains and those who do not remain? It's not the context, it is not the scenario, it is not the time in which the person lives. It's the coverage, it's the blood, and that changes everything, because it brings that reality to a personal level. This is not just a theological connection. It's not just an interesting revelation. It is something that directly touches the lives of those who are listening now, because the same question that existed that night in Egypt, it still exists today. What's about your life? What covers you? What defines you? And this is where a lot of people stop, because you understand the pattern, understand the connection, understand the importance of the Lamb, but he does not perceive an essential detail, a detail that has been present since the Exodus. It passes through the cross, and it reaches the Apocalypse, a detail that completely changes the way we understand all this. But there is a detail about the Lamb that most people never realized. Now let me say something directly to you, bluntly. So far, we have talked about Exodus. We have talked about Revelation. We have talked about standards, plagues, judgment, the Lamb. But there is a moment when all this is no longer just information and becomes personal, because this is not just history. It's not just an ancient record of something that happened in Egypt. And it's not just a distant prophecy either, about something that might happen in the future. This is not just about Egypt. It's not just about the end times. This is about you. Now stop for a second and think sincerely. That night in Egypt, no one could ignore what was happening. Judgment was coming. It was real. It was inevitable. And there was only one way to be safe: the blood. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. Or was it covered? Or it wasn't. And that same logic keeps echoing. Because when you look at the pattern that runs through the Bible, it is clear that there is always a moment of decision, a moment when you can no longer be neutral, a moment when you can't postpone it anymore. And perhaps the most important question is not, when will this happen? But rather, am I ready? Because the truth is that many people know the story, but he never stopped to apply this to his own life. Do you know about the Exodus? Have you ever heard of the Apocalypse? Understand the concepts. But this question has never been asked honestly. Who is covered? Who is prepared? Because in the end, it's not about knowledge. It's not about how much you know from the Bible. It's not about how many times you've heard these stories. It's about position. It's about spiritual condition. It's about what's about your life. And that's serious, because the pattern is clear. Whenever there is judgment, there is also a separation. Always. And this separation is not based on appearance. It is not based on religion. It is not based on tradition. It is based on something much deeper, in belonging, in coverage. Now think about it. In Egypt, everyone was in the same environment, but not all of them had the same result. Today, everyone lives in the same world, but that doesn't mean everyone will meet the same fate. And this is not to generate fear. It's to generate awareness, because the message of the Bible has never been just about judgment. It has always been about salvation, on a path, about a way of being protected, and this path always pointed to the same place, the Lamb. So perhaps the most important question you can ask yourself right now is simple, but extremely profound. What's it about? My life? I'm covered. Or am I just watching from afar? Because in the end, the difference will not be in the scenario. It will not be in the historical moment. It will not be in the circumstances. It's going to be in it. And this decision, it is not collective, it is personal. It is yours. And after all that we saw, let me bring you this very clearly. What happened in Egypt? It was not an isolated event. It was not just a demonstration of power. It was not just the liberation of a people. It was a revelation of how God acts when the moment of judgment comes. And this leads us to a conclusion that cannot be ignored. The same God who judged Egypt, it is the same who will judge the world. That doesn't change. Time passes, cultures change, systems evolve, but God remains the same. His character does not change. His justice does not change. His way of acting, it doesn't change. And that's exactly why the pattern repeats itself. In Egypt, there was a system that seemed unshakable and fell. In Revelation, we see a system that also seems strong, but that will be shaken. In Egypt, there was a warning, there was time, there was opportunity, and yet, the time came when the trial could no longer be postponed. And this needs to generate serious reflection, because a lot of people look at these stories and think, that was way back, that's something from the future. But the truth is that there is a common point between these two moments, a point that connects everything, the human response. There have always been two groups, those who listened and they answered, and those who ignored it. And in the end, this difference was decisive. Now let me tell you something with all sincerity. This video is not just to inform you, it's not just to show you an interesting biblical connection, it's to make you think, it's to lead you to a decision. Because when judgment comes, there is no improvisation. There is no second chance at that moment. The preparation happens before. The decision happens before. And that's why this message is so important. Because it doesn't just point to events. She points to a choice that each person needs to make. And maybe you've never thought of it that way. Maybe you've always seen these stories as something distant. But now, you realize that there is a pattern, that there is a repetition, that there is a clear message being revealed. And that changes everything, because it takes you out of the position of spectator and puts you inside the story. And now, the question is no longer about Egypt. It's no longer about the apocalypse. It's about you, about your position, about his decision. And if this video opened your mind, if it made you see something you had never noticed. So, I want to invite you to continue this journey. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share this video with someone who also needs to understand this. And tell me here in the comments, have you noticed this connection? Because this is just the beginning. In the next video, we will go even deeper into this mystery, and you will understand why the Passover lamb, it's not just a detail of the story, but the key to understanding Revelation